So, Larry, a lot happened this week, a lot of it having to do with Ukraine, but we also got CPI numbers that came in where they were projected to come in, but they were the highest in 40 years, 7.9% year over year. What do you make of those numbers? And by the way, let me ask you the unfair question. When is this going to peak?
Look, these numbers were not a surprise. And by the way, while inflation was 7.9% over the last year, if you annualize the monthly figure, it was close to 10%. So we're not seeing deceleration yet. And given what's happened in commodity markets, I don't think we're going to see deceleration for several months. This is a grave problem. The president was wrong to blame this month's number on Ukraine. Everybody had been expecting from the time before Putin launched the invasion that inflation was going to accelerate from January to February. This is a consequence fundamentally of an overheated economy, and we're not going to have a full solution until we do something about that overheated economy. That's just the fact of the situation. Buying America will make this worse because it will mean higher prices. Blaming corporate greed will chill business confidence, will reduce investment in expanding capacity, and will likely make this worse. We need to simply operate the tools of macroeconomic policy in responsible ways.
So, Larry, you say that buying America will make it worse. Will not buying Russia also make it worse? Because we also had that oil ban imposed by the president.
Look, I think that it probably will raise the prices of gasoline for some interval. It'll raise the prices of heating oil for some interval. But look, this is the price of freedom. The question of our times is, what is the future of democracy, market-based, freedom-respecting systems like our own? And we can't have them endure if tyrants can invade neighbors with impunity. And so if higher prices of gasoline are the price of freedom, it is a price that this generation of Americans should pay. And frankly, it's a small price compared to the price that's being paid in Ukraine or the price that past generations of Americans have paid.
Larry, this week we had more sanctions, and we also had, of course, those CPI numbers. Next week, we have the Federal Reserve. Given the alarming rate of inflation, as you describe it, what would you have the Federal Reserve do?
Look, I think the Fed needs to begin tightening. The Fed needs to signal that it's going to do what's necessary to contain inflation. It needs to make contact once again with traditional Federal Reserve concepts like the neutral rate of interest compared to the actual real rate of interest. It needs to acknowledge what has happened with respect to monetary aggregates, though those are anything but conclusive. And it needs to portray itself as troubled by how egregiously it misestimated the inflation problem through all of last year. And it needs to tell us what it's doing to learn from that experience. It needs to tell us what its process is for changing frameworks away from a framework that led it into disastrous error. This is not a time for an insouciant central bank.
Larry, this is a time in Washington that is different from any other, in recent history at least. There's been a lot of back and forth over some things that people might think are even silly debates. Are we moving toward a more serious Washington?
I hope so. I think it's a time for what I like to call a new seriousness It's a seriousness made necessary by the gravity of the threats we are now seeing, especially with the potentially emerging axis between China and Russia. Whether the issue is coming together to maintain America's technological leadership, whether it is recognizing that the quality of our education system is central to the kind of leadership that we have been able to provide in the world, whether the seriousness is over repairing our infrastructure. You know, it was a national security concern that drove Dwight Eisenhower to the interstate highway system. It was concerns about the power of the American example that drove the Civil Rights Act in important respects. We need to move beyond partisan bickering and move beyond excuse mongering to ask about the fundamental systems of the economy and how they can be made to work better. And that means both and thinking rather than either or thinking. Democrats are right that we need to be heavily invested in renewables. Republicans are right that we need pipelines for energy security and for the capacity to help Europe be energy secure. Democrats are right that we need more resources infused into education. Republicans are right that we need higher standards and more competition in our education system. Democrats are right that we need more resources put into infrastructure. Republicans are right that we need those infrastructure investments made with much more rapidity and much more efficiency in procurement. Democrats are right that we need to monitor and make sure that businesses are operating in profitable ways. Republicans are right that business confidence and cooperation with business is important. We have common adversaries in China and in Russia where we need to stand up. We have adversaries at home in extremism and radical populists who want to tear down a system that has made this the greatest nation in the history of the world. And we need to come together. It's not about doing hits on TV. It's not about doing an event for a constituency. This is a moment of major challenge that deserves major response from our nation's leadership.
And finally, Larry, when you were Secretary of Treasury, you presided over sanctions regimes. We have seen, I think this week, the unveiling of something that history's never seen. That is the extent of these sanctions being imposed on Russia, how deeply they go, also how many countries are joining together on this. What are we learning about sanctions? And not only from the government, but also what is now being called self-sanctions, where some companies are saying, even if I'm not required to forego dealing with Russia, I'm not going to go in and deal with them.
David, they can work. They can, and I think they are, doing enormous damage to the Russian economy. I think we need to think carefully about just how we administer them. If we require people to sell too fast and to divest too fast, we're going to let bad guys buy things for a song, whether those things are debt securities or whether those things are corporate assets. So I think we need to be thoughtful about how we administer this, but I think this has been a substantial achievement, and it's positive. I've also been gratified to see the way companies have stepped up and recognize their moral obligations. I think it's another sign of what I think I underestimated at first, which is the change in the norms in our system towards expecting corporations to be attentive to stakeholders as well as shareholders, and the common interest in our country in security is one of those important stakes that companies have to respect.